Welcome to this live stream from, I'm at Stockholm School of Economics in the library, and Athena Farrokhzad is at home. The plan was that Athena should be here meeting our librarian Clara, but since due to sickness, this is the way it ended up. But nice to meet you and welcome via Zoom, Athena.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you. I wish I could be there.
So this conversation is part of art initiative here at Stockholm School of Economics, our literary agenda, where we together, staff and students, read books. And we also invite writers and poets to the school. And normally we do it as normal meetings here, but now we do it like this. And we're going to talk to you, Athena, now until 6 o'clock. And you are a poet and a translator and a teacher also.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how would you present yourself?
Well, I would actually present myself that way. I think poetry is always my point of departure. Poetry is how I started and how I continued, and what I'm mostly preoccupied with. But
do you think you can?
Took me.
Thank
you. Poetry also took me to other places within the field of literature. So nowadays I spend some of my time writing, performing poetry. But I think when you call yourself a poet, people get the image that this is what I spend, 8 hours a day doing, which I rarely do actually. But other than that, I also I do other things that sort of depart from the experience of reading and writing poetry. So I translate. From English, French, and sometimes from languages that I don't speak.
Wow.
So I've translated quite a few books by now. I'm also a playwright, which means that I write first for theater, for the stage, which I also came to through poetry. And then I'm a literary critic. I write reviews sometimes, and I teach. I mainly teach at a school outside of Stockholm called Biskops Arnös Författarskola, Biskops Arnös creative writing school, and I've been teaching there for 10 years actually, and I used to be a student there myself. So I try to combine all these occupations within the literary field, and they all have to do with reading poetry and sort of putting into words the experience of meeting poetry, either alone or together with other people.
And what would you say that poetry is? How would you describe poetry?
Well, I mean, I could describe it in many different ways. If you would ask a literary scholar, he or she would say that poetry is, what literature and the history of literature consists of, together with prose and drama. So it's sort of one third of the history of literature, and it's a very long tradition. But I think for me, poetry is, it is something that draws one's attention towards language. It is a field that wants to sort of create attention around language itself, and I sometimes think about it as the ground research of language. I can't come to think of anything that is as close to sort of language itself, language as in the imagery or the sound of language, as poetry is. So I mean, that could be an answer. Um, another answer would be sort of the lyrical and what people perceive as the lyrical in their lives or in the world, which could be many different things. I mean, poetry could be lyrical, but also songs and music could be lyrical, and lyrical in the sense that it, plays with the musicality of language, but also in the sense that it's connected to sort of the big issues of life, in existential and societal, relational way. So poetry is many different things, but poetry could also be a poem.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your history as a writer. When did you start, and how come, and why did you continue to write?
Well, you get that question quite a lot when you're a writer or an artist, and I like to say that for me, I think the biggest question isn't why one starts, but why one continues. Because if you live close to children, or if you have been a child yourself, you know that it's very intuitive for kids to express themselves, through many different mediums, through singing, through acting, through modeling, play, through painting, through many through telling stories. This is what children do, and I think for me it's a very human instinct to express yourself, and also to sort of modify the materiality of the word. It is a part of being human, sort of coming to the word and discovering what the word consists of, and what its materials are, and what its limits are, and then wanting to sort of intervene in that, leaving your own mark, or sort of modeling the world in a sense. But I think all children do that, and then some children don't stop, and also specialize in one of these mediums, like I have done, for instance. Like people specialize in other things, but I think.
So why did you continue writing?
I was always extremely fascinated by language. And the way that language could do things to me, emotionally, and affect me, although I sometimes didn't even understand what it was about. So I think, like, one of the things that I remember as a child was listening to stories, either read by other people, or like recorded stories that were played to me. And a lot of these stories were written in rhyme by poets, but for children, with quite an advanced language. And a lot of the times I couldn't really fully grasp what the words meant, but I was very fascinated by the fact that these words and sentences and stories affected me so deeply, although I couldn't really always understand what they said. So I think this, for me, it had a lot to do with being caught and fascinated by language, and the arbitrarity of language. For instance, the fact that we all together as a community of humans have decided, what things should be called in a most of the times arbitrary way, and that it still makes sense to us, and that children come to the word without, language in this sense, but then sort of enter in the word of language. I think these things are utterly fascinating to me, and also, I mean, although the entire field of linguistics has been researching, what is the human being as a sort of linguistic phenomenon, a lot of these questions one can still not grasp. and understand.
So how
So
you're,
I think, yeah, I think for me it had to do with that, and then the fact that I was able to continue. I was a matter of being encouraged and having the material access to libraries and books and adults who saw this as meaningful and interesting. Yeah, so I think a lot of people could do that. Yeah.
This is your first book, isn't it? Vitsvit in Swedish and White Blight in English. How old were you when this was published?
I was quite old, actually. I was 29.
29, okay.
But yeah, and I had been writing on this book for many years. It's quite a short book. It consists of 70 pages and quite a few lines on every page. But I spent 5 years writing it, and well, when I say 5 years, I don't mean from 1995, but I mean it's something that I lived with for quite a long time. But actually, before I published this book, I also did a lot of collaborations together with my friends who are also poets, and published like collectively written chapbooks and my literary magazines and stuff like that, more in like an underground scene, and anthologies of poetry. So I think for me that was my best writing school.
No. But was this when you became a poet, when you were published, or were you a poet before?
No, no, I wouldn't say that. No, well, maybe that was when I was viewed as a poet in other people's eyes. But but no, I don't think this book made me a poet. I think it made me maybe a public person rather, and a read poet. But that's something else.
But can you tell us a little bit about what it is about?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a book it's situated within the framework of a family, and it has some sort of prologue or preface where the narrator of the book, speaks for one entire page and says, "My family arrived here in a Marxist tradition," and speaks about sort of the tradition and the consequences that brought the family to this migrant family to the context where they now are. And then the rest of the book is a dialogue between these family members. So the book has a mother and a father and a grandmother and an uncle and a brother. And basically, the only thing that happens is that these characters speak to each other and discuss different matters that have to do with the experiences of revolution and war and migration and racism and whiteness. And well, I think rather than it being about these issues, it is about these family members negotiating how the narrative of these issues should be written. Negotiating and sometimes like overtly fighting. So and also how these experiences affect their relationships towards their bodies, their languages, the surrounding landscape, each other, and so on. Yeah.
It's interesting because you almost use more words now describing the book.
Yeah.
Than I mean, this is one example of. So it's really, really an intense book about being a family.
I was looking for the founding experiences or the fundamental scenes of these topics of migration and war and racism and so on. And I wanted it to be a book that wasn't about one specific family, but a family as an archetype or a mother as an archetype, or and something that could be applicable to many different places and many different people, you know. So it took me a long time to find also the form of this family dialogue, and because I think a lot of times a writing process is about finding the form that enables experience, and before you do that, you know, you're not at all sure that what you're writing will be readable to someone else, even though it might be important to you.
It must be fantastic to spend 5 years thinking and trying to.
Well, I don't
Like,
know. Well, yeah. Well, I mean, it's wonderful to be able to really engage and dive into something in a profound manner. But it's also, I thought writing this book was actually quite terrible, and I thought I would never finish because it has a very repetitive form. It consists of phrases, lines that go, my mother said, my brother said, my grandmother said, my father said, and I thought, Jesus, this could go on, you know, for all eternity. Yeah.
But it didn't. It's
it
only
didn't.
No. It's only 70 pages. Yeah. So another big question: why are you writing today?
Yeah. I think, well, the main reason is probably because I'm still as fascinated by language and what language can do and what language can sort of put you in and put you through, as I was when I was a child. But I think nowadays I also have a platform from where I can speak and address certain issues, not only in poetry, but also in plays or in articles or sort of participating in the cultural debate. And I think this idea of sort of the struggle over narrative and that society, to a great extent, consists of this struggle over narrative is very fundamental to me, and you know how things are addressed and what things are called have profound consequences for how societies are built and how humans are treated. So I think for me, poetry and literature is a way of participating in society, you know, a way of participating in this struggle over narrative. But it's also, of course, at the same time, and this is what is so wonderful about poetry, that I mean, it has to do with all these things that are quite logical and rational, you know, and communicative, but it also has to do with the incomprehensibilities of the world of the language. It also has to do with the musicality and sounds of the world. It also has to do with creating beauty and creating something that can catch the attention of someone and affect them. So I think this way of moving sort of through something very moving between something very affective and something very logical at the same time is very fundamental to me.
Can you give us some examples of what kind of narratives you are trying to change?
Wow, I think a lot of narratives, but I mean, one thing that I think about is the idea of knowledge. For instance, what is knowledge? And who is seen as a bearer of knowledge? Where is language? Where is knowledge produced? And what are sort of the ideological points of departure or implications of what is understood as knowledge? I come to think of this because we are in the context of university also. But I think that's a very big issue for me. And I mean, could poetry be a bearer of knowledge? Could you communicate, news within the form of poetry, for instance?
Or research?
Yes, or research, definitely. So I mean that's only one of many examples, but how knowledge is understood in society, for instance.
You once wrote on Instagram that it's important to you that poetry isn't bullshit. You remember that?
I do remember it, but it was in a very specific context.
Oh, okay.
Should I tell you about it? Was there's a poet, a Swedish poet, who wrote a poem, a very beautiful poem, who's about sort of the migrant, the idea of the migrant being someone who has the human right to be received, someone
the human right to,
and someone to be received. But received in a context of where he or she could be given shelter, someone vulnerable who society has the responsibility of taking care of. A very beautiful poem. This poem was broadcasted at Swedish radio, and at the same time, this poet is someone who has sort of profiled himself the last years as someone supporting the new migration laws of Sweden, which means restrictions for asylum seekers and basically nowadays the impossibility of being granted asylum and definitely permanent asylum if you're a refugee or an asylum seeker. so yeah, I think when I say it's so important to me that poetry isn't bullshit, this is an example of it. That you can't just write something and think, well, in my poem, I, human rights or migrants' rights or sort of universal values, and speak about beauty and love and vulnerability. But then, in the political debate, I stand for something totally different. That to me isn't. I mean, that's an unacceptable paradox because of many different reasons. Because it's politically problematic, but it's also a way of saying, what you write in poetry, well, it doesn't really count. That it doesn't need to have implications, ideological implications for what you actually think in the world. So yes, it's important that poetry isn't bullshit.
But do you think that poetry has a role in the big conversation in Sweden today or in society today?
Well, it has and it has not. I mean, poetry is, as I was saying before, it is a form of producing knowledge. It's a form of investigating language. It is a form of taking part of the struggle over society through language. And of course, all these things have political implications. But then again, not a lot of people read poetry. Not a lot of people care about poetry, and not a lot of people think poetry is something that is either interesting or accessible to them. So of course it has a role, but maybe its effects can't be sort of immediately detected. I think a lot of things together form sort of the hegemony that we live under, or the way that society is shaped. But their consequences are maybe not as direct as what takes place in the parliament. Because I'm very interested in hegemony, sort of as a notion, and what is thought and what is found to be reasonable in a society at a given moment in time. And I think, well, poetry can and should, to some extent, sort of participate in the formation of hegemony.
Do you feel that you have changed society with your poetry?
No, no. No, I think it would be very difficult to point at a certain poem or a certain poet and say this has impacted society. So no, I couldn't say that. But
That depends on what impact is, I guess. I mean, of course you have.
Yeah,
In minor ways.
yeah. Well, but maybe I affected somebody, who read my books and thought, they were good or bad, or who they meant something to.
I'm sure.
But it depends on what we mean when we say society, because I mean, society is a very sort of huge notion, but in the end, society is also us, all of us who consist it.
We spoke a little bit about it, but what's your opinion on, does it matter who wrote the text? Or is it the text itself? That's the important thing.
Well, it's a big question, and sort of generally put now, I think I would answer it differently depending on sort of in relation to what question or person or text you ask this, but well, I think a lot of times you can tell by reading a poem who wrote it. Actually, that those things are more inseparable than you think, and I think. But it's a big question. But
yes, it's a huge question. But
it's a huge question. I think it has to do with knowledge, from the viewpoint or the point of departure that the poem speaks or stays silent. What does the poem speak about and what doesn't it speak about? Says, I think, a lot about who wrote it.
And who reads it.
And who reads it, of course. Yeah.
And then also last year you edited this, what do you call it? Anthology?
It's an anthology.
Anthology, yeah. It's Berör and förstör. That's in English would be...
it would be maybe touch and destroy.
Touch and destroy.
It doesn't really sound good in English. I mean, it's a rhyme in Swedish. Berör och förstör. And berör also has a wider, I think, meaning than
touching.
Maybe it doesn't. Yeah. But it's an anthology of contemporary poetry in Swedish, edited for young adults, and it's meant to function as an introduction to poetry for young adults, but also for adults who sort of want to orient themselves in what poetry is. And as we've said many times while working with this anthology, it's me and my friend and colleague Kristofer Folkhammar who edited it, that we've sort of said many times that you can be young in relationship to poetry all your life.
Yes.
So it's,
so the target group isn't like teenagers or...
Not necessarily. The target group is, I think, anyone interested in orienting themselves in what contemporary poetry in Swedish is. And the idea is, I think about it's a tacky metaphor, but I think about the anthology as a candy store, that you should go in and there should be something for everybody, something for every taste, and you find something that you like, and from there you know how to go on and how to continue. So we really sort of try to emphasize a mix of many different ways of writing poetry. Yeah.
So do you have any other advices for a person who is not used to read poetry? How do you start?
I think my most important advice, and which is something that I speak about a lot and that we thought about a lot while working with this anthology, is that poetry isn't necessarily about understanding. Because I think a lot of times people say to me, well, I'm interested in reading poetry, or I'm interested in this book or this poem, but I don't understand it. And there's this idea that in order to be able to read poetry, one should understand a lot. One should, have access to many different sources of knowledge and references in order to be able to decode and detect, and decipher what the poem is about. And I mean, that could be interesting, deciphering and decoding the content and the meaning of a poem and its references could be very interesting. But I think that is, for me, that's not the sort of premier thing when it comes to reading poetry. Poetry, as any other kinds of, art, is mainly about sort of meeting the artwork and what it does to you when you meet it. I think poetry and reading poetry is much more emotional than it is often understood and taught within the sort of school system. I think that
like what can you describe what a poem that can do to you?
I mean, it can make you happy. It can make you sad. It can make you laugh. It can make you. It can instigate you or make you desire something, or it can sort of touch you,
or confuse you,
or definitely confuse you. Yes. So I think this sort of the premier and initial meeting with the poem is really not about understanding it, but it is about sort of what you understand through being touched. So I would say, don't focus so much on the understanding part, but think about, like, what does it do to you? How does it feel when you read this line? And I mean, maybe there's only one line in this book that is interesting to a reader, and that's that's good enough. Then you can read that line for an eternity. And a lot of times, I think the things that speak to you and touch you are also, in some sense, incomprehensible.
Yeah.
They are the things that you don't fully understand, you don't fully grasp, and because of that, you have to sort of continue coming back to them.
I have two questions here from the audience.
Yeah.
And one is, how would you describe your style of writing? From Theo.
Well, that's a good question. I think, well, others are a lot better at describing what I do than I am myself, I think. But what I can describe what I try to do, which is, I think I'm sort of I come from and I'm raised in three different literary and artistic and poetical traditions. One being sort of the lyrical tradition, which I spoke about before, the sort of the musical, the singing, which has to do with beauty and existence and love and death and the sublime.
Like to what poet? Edith Södergran or?
Like I think most of the poets that you would think about. Okay. I think also like Edith Södergran, or I don't know, like Shakespeare, or like what people mostly associate poetry with, the rhymes and the beauty and something very sort of sublime and metaphysical somehow. But that's one thing, and but another thing is sort of the political tradition that I'm also raised in or schooled in, with a lot of the poets that I translated myself, for instance, belong to this tradition. Like poetry that sort of situates itself in its time and in its place and speaks about the world and its power relations and its struggles and its horrors and its also desires for change. So
can you give some names?
Like I've translated Adrienne Rich, for instance, the American poet, or Audre Lorde that I'm working on right now, or Jacqueline Woodson that I've translated. Many. Well, there are all of the words that are poets who work in this tradition. And the last and third one, I think, is a conceptual tradition, which is maybe not always what you associate poetry with, but sort of the conceptual tradition being a line where you work a lot sort of with the materiality of language itself and its and sort of restraints and forms and formulas and repetitions and well, as you think about like conceptual art, for instance, which are not maybe primarily about content, but a lot about form. So I think what I try to do, at least, I don't know if I manage or succeed, is to combine these different traditions in my own writing, to sort of write something that it is simultaneously lyrical, conceptual, and political. And I think for me, that is what I feel is true, or that is my way of coming close to truth somehow, something that is both situated in the world, in society, but also sort of in this sublimity of existence, but also in sort of language itself. Yeah.
How do you start when you write a poem?
Yeah, that's the most difficult question of all. If I knew, that's like the $1 million question. And I think that's a difference between the happy poets and the unhappy poets. I don't know if there are any happy poets, but the unhappy poets are the ones who don't know how to start or how to finish, but know that they have to write. And I think I'm one of those. So I don't really have a good answer, but I think a lot of times it starts with either a phrase, that comes to me, a phrase, a word, sometimes like a music, musicality of language that is not even a phrase, a tone or prosody or something, that doesn't leave me alone. That either something that I invented or something I heard or something that sort of keeps coming back and insisting on my attention. And I have to sort of write around that in order to understand why. But yeah, but then I think also like paradoxes and questions that are unsolvable are very central in my writing. When I think, the feeling of being stuck or hitting a wall, or like being at a crossroads and not knowing, sort of being stuck, not being able to advance.
You mean in life? Not in the writing. No.
Yeah, in life, but that produces sort of, I think, the impulse of writing somehow.
Okay. Wow. And the last question is, do you have any poets you would recommend to us?
Oh, I have so many poets to recommend to you. And I'm currently thinking a lot about Audre Lorde, actually, because I'm translating her, and a Black American poet who was active sort of within the feminist lesbian movement in the 60s, 70s, 80s, who's written remarkable poetry because it is, I think, at the same time, very accessible, very direct, and very intricate and advanced. And another one that I always mention is Gloria Gervitz, who is a Jewish Mexican poet who lives in the US nowadays. And she's published a book called Migrations, Migraciones, Migrationer in Swedish. And it's a remarkable work. She published it for the first time in the 70s. And since then, she has been constantly republishing different versions of this book. So this book is her life work, and she's worked on it for 40 years. And it has sort of the density of something that someone has worked on for 40 years. Can you imagine? So I think it's really, really, really a remarkable work that I would recommend to everyone because she, everything is there.
Oh, I will try to buy some books of those authors and that book. And we also have your books here in the library. And now time is out. Very nice to talk to you. And we hope to see you here at the school sometimes in real life also.
I would love that.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much
for today. I will end the meeting now. Ciao.